Hello, I'm speaking today with Mohsin Siddiqui, who is the founder of Fikr Institute. He's also an independent consultant in terms of anything related to human resources. Mohsin, welcome. I'm going to be talking to Mohsin about advanced techniques to ensure that HR is driving business growth, of course. But before that, I want to tap into this topic by asking you, is it really the responsibility of HR to drive business growth?
So thank you for having me, Omnia. I think the question is a really good one. I have a slightly different view on the role of HR and business growth, right? I think that HR is part of the business. So for me, it's always strange when people talk about the business and HR, because one doesn't really kind of exist without the other, in my view. So I think yes, like any function, like any part
Oh,
of an organization, we're responsible for driving the business growth um, in the best way that we can as an HR function. And that might be because we are responsible for making sure that we're working to optimize the way people get stuff done, that we're managing risk around things, that we're looking at how to optimize the way work gets done and how employees and workers engage with the organization and what the organization needs to do to set them up to be successful, right? Whether that's making them successful or giving them the room to experiment and fail and learn from that. So there's a couple of different ways, but I very much believe that HR is accountable for the success of the business.
right. And it's good that you mentioned the word failed. How to fail, actually. How can HR drive failure?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a great joke in there somewhere. I'm sure there'll be a thousand comments about how HR can help people fail, but I think the fundamental point for me has always been, look, we learn by doing for the most part, right? Some people learn academically, some people learn experientially, some people learn in their own ways. There's no sort of one fixed way of doing stuff, right? No matter what anyone tells you about learning styles and things like that, which is all kind of a myth. What's really interesting is that if you look at some of the research, you look at what's happened and a lot of research actually over the last 20, 30 years, what we see happening is that people wind up becoming really successful when they experiment with something. And so we spend a lot of time talking about how do we make people successful. And you learn by doing, right? It's a little bit like if you, this is going to sound awful, but if you cut yourself while chopping up some food, you learn to be more careful with the knife, right? And that's not to say that you should wound yourself in the pursuit of work, but what is interesting is to think about the idea that as an organization, as a function, you're going to see a lot of publications out there about psychological safety, about creating safe spaces. The point of creating a safe space is not to protect people from the world at large and to say, hey, we're going to make sure nothing bad ever happens to you. It's to say, hey, what we're going to try and do is give you the opportunity to try something new. And if it doesn't succeed, that's okay. You What's the lessons that you've learned from it, right? And it's the whole concept of not providing feedback, but of feeding forward and thinking about what have you learned from this that you will avoid doing or that you will definitely try to implement in the future. And creating that is really scary because people don't like to fail, right? Nobody likes to fail. Nobody likes to have their competence questioned. Nobody likes to think, oh, if I don't do this, someone's going to think less of me.
Hmm. I don't like to fail, but I don't mind failing. But when you're speaking, I'm just when you're talking, I'm just thinking, what about bigger corporates? They don't like to fail. Um, how but they do sometimes. So
Yes.
how do you envision how do they get up after that? How do they use failure to actually both push themselves forward?
Yeah, it's another great question. Thank you for asking that. I think, in my experience, and I've worked with quite a few big corporates, right? In my sort of past life in house in the world of HR. So the first thing is big corporates don't ever like to admit to failure because that wobbles the share price. It makes shareholders nervous, um, and yet they fail quite a lot. There's very few organizations that admit to failure or having said we tried this and it didn't work. A lot of the time, what you'll hear is we've pivoted, or we've transitioned to a new model, or we're doing something different, or we're evolving our approach. Um, if you think about how organizations recover from this stuff, the organizations that recover from it fastest and best are the ones that acknowledge that there's an issue of some kind. So they tend to sit up and say, okay, we tried this, it didn't work. We need to do something better. We need to do something different.
Companies like Boeing, for example, companies that have been succeeding and failing, succeeding and failing, succeeding and failing. What makes them able to, what drives them to actually stand up after they fell?
Yeah, that's again, it's a really good question, right? Look, I think there's a couple of things. The first one is a really pragmatic thing, right? If they fail, they put hundreds of thousands of people um, out of work, make them, they lose their investments, they lose their livelihood. There's a huge sense of, I'd say, social responsibility. I'm not saying that the companies are socially responsible necessarily, but there's almost peer pressure. You can't fail because if you fail, X, Y, and Z is going to happen, right? It's exactly like you said. These companies are too big to fail. So you see government interventions, you see people stepping in to kind of buttress them in some way, shape, or form. They take on more debt and raise money from other places. Um, I think a great example of companies that fail and are successful simultaneously are pharmaceutical companies, right? The amount of time and energy they spend in research and development for I can't remember the exact number, but I think it's for every one successful drug, there's like a couple of hundred unsuccessful ones. But that's the nature of the industry, right? They know that they have to experiment because without experimentation and trying to out new things, they're not going to be successful, which is why it takes medications, drugs to take so long to come out of an R&D pipeline. Um, and I think what keeps them going are two things. I think the first bit is knowing that there's a longer term payoff, right? And this is a problem, I think, with sort of late stage capitalism as a whole and companies that are driven by analyst calls and quarterly financials rather than taking a longer term view on these things. Um, they tend to be very reactive. So there's a lot of tendency to kind of just look at what do we need to report on to keep the share price up. That's a fundamental driver. You can say anything about, stakeholder engagement rather than shareholder engagement, but the fundamental truth is CEOs get rewarded on whether they've driven the share price up or not a lot of the time. So they're really oriented towards that. Whereas you have some companies, and I think Mastercard was a great example of this. I think pharma is generally a good example of this. They take a long-term view. They say, look, we know what our pipeline looks like. If we are successful in 5 years down the line, that's brilliant, right? And we can fail a million times underneath that. We don't have to report on the failure. But the truth is that, and I say this, I've said this in banks, I've said this in energy, I've said this in healthcare, in tech, in all the sectors I've worked. If you don't make space for people to fail, then all you're really doing is preparing them to be successful in a really narrow set of circumstances, right? They're only going to be able to deliver when everything is set up to be optimal for them to be successful. And that's just not what
Right.
life is, right? The world
That
changes
brings
really
me,
fast. That's
but
okay.
I agree with you that if you don't feel like if you don't let people fail, are actually preparing them to fail on bigger tasks. So that brings me to the part of the interview where actually it says HR drives business growth is by a lot. I would say if you give people the room to fail, you're actually allowing the business to grow. Would you agree with or would you contest it?
Most things in life, it depends. Um,
Mhm.
I think yes, you have to have room to fail, but you can't set the expectation that we want you to fail or we intend for you to fail and therefore it's okay, right? It's a difficult question actually, because I think what you have to do is you have to kind of almost set up guardrails around what failure looks like, right? What kind of failures are acceptable and what kind are genuinely unacceptable. So, and I'm being a little dramatic here, but failure that causes loss of life is unacceptable under any
No,
circumstances. Right? Health, safety violation
right.
failures, those are non-negotiable. However, if you fail at doing something and that means your PowerPoint is delayed by a week because you couldn't get the right information together, that's okay. But at what point do you see failure improving practice and behavior and driving growth? And at what point do you see it becoming an inhibitor because everyone's starting to ghost and saying, it's okay if I fail, there's no real repercussions, right? And I'm not saying that you have to punish people for failure, but what you have to do is say, look, there are acceptable bounds of failure. If you were taking a risk to try something new and innovative that could bring benefit to us and it didn't work out, that's okay. If you failed because you were just sitting around all day twiddling your thumbs and not doing anything, that's unacceptable, right? So there needs to be a balance between driving performance for the individual and performance for the organization, but giving people the space to feel that actually, if I mess something up once or twice, it's not the end of the world. It's not a career limiting move for me. And that's a tricky balance to find.
It is, to be honest. I'm thinking about financial failure. I'm thinking about millions of dollars kind of failure. What happens then?
Yeah.
Um, but that's massive
That's
discussion, to
that's
be
normally
honest.
that's normally where private equity sweeps in and buys you on the cheap.
Mohsen, just to conclude our conversation, I want to ask you, are there strategies that you would recommend HR to use, anyone in HR to use, just basic strategies to actually equip people?
So strategies for success, not failure. Um, yeah, I think there's two or three things that are really, really clear. That help people be successful, right? And ironically enough, the first one of those is clarity. Be really, really crisp about what you expect people to do, right? Um, People frequently say that if you want to be successful, you have to be again, it's a bit of a cliche, right? It's a bit like the smart targets thing that everyone talks about, right? Be really specific, be clear with people, be equitable with people, because that'll help them be successful if they feel like the work and the effort that they're doing is going to be rewarded proportionately. Um, and I actually think this is one of the most important things that the human resources of the people function. I like calling it people because I think it is about people rather than sort of allocation of individuals into boxes, right? But I think this is one of the most important things that people can do. And the people function has to do. We have to speak truth to power, right? We have to challenge and you know, I don't like the cliches about getting a seat at the table, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody's sort of sitting there demanding, I don't see CFOs, begging for a seat at the table, right? Nobody ever says, oh, finance can't be at the table, they're not adding business value. Um, but I also think we overstate, we get obsessed with how do we drive business impact, and we forget about our primary responsibility, which is twofold. We're a risk management function in a lot of ways. We look at optimizing how companies can work and create working conditions that will make people successful. And that involves a few things. Challenging senior stakeholders, including the C-suite, frequently, which you should, I think, when you know that they're doing something that may not be morally wrong, but you know that it's violating sort of some basic standards of how you should be treating people, right? I think we have to treat employees really fairly, but I think we also have to make it really clear to employees we're not your friends. We're here as a company, we're neutral arbiters, right? Almost like being it sounds very overblown, but almost like being judges in a court of law. Our job is to help interpret and create policies and procedures and conditions that enable companies to be successful and that enable employees to be successful. And to do that, we have to create conditions where there's clear transparency, where there's consequence management for all, not just for, the new hire who's been there for a year and doesn't quite know what he or she is doing at the moment or what they're doing at the moment, but also for the C-suite, where bad behavior is caught out, flagged, and challenged. And I think the other bit is building better leaders and greater managers. This is something one of my old bosses used to say. Our job is to help people improve their skills, right? It's to create an environment where people can get better at what they do. And by doing that, we can help organizations become more and more successful. And one of the most important things we can do is look to evidence of what works rather than relying on sort of anecdotal things. And I'm a big believer in evidence, right? I'm a big believer in data and being informed by data, not being driven by data, but being informed by data and understanding how to apply it to scenarios. So we have to become, if we want to create, I've gone on a bit of a tangent, but we come back to your fundamental question. How do you create environments that help people and organizations be successful? How do we help them deliver business value? Base our record. We have to think like we're making commercial proposals. We have to think about the evidence that backs those up and the logic we're using rather than the slightly woolly-headed logic of, oh, the CEO likes it, so we have to do it. We have to be able to challenge, speak truth to power, and we have to encourage people to be in an environment where it is okay for them to try things out. And if they are successful, wonderful, they're rewarded disproportionately. If they are unsuccessful, they're not penalized disproportionately, right? The risk-reward ratio needs to be balanced out.
Right.
And it's a really tricky juggling act.
Mohsin, thank you very much for your time. We can talk about this subject from here to God knows when. This has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.